So I'm going to go through the session again. It'll take approximately 30 minutes, possibly a little bit less. And hopefully this will make it all very clear for you and give you a resource to work from over the coming weeks. So just to remind you, this is what I'm going to go through now with you. We're going to look at the kind of the basics of what it's all about, this adjusting to managing remotely. I'm going to, I suppose, put a big emphasis on how now the fact of managing remotely within the context of this crisis, that the new role of the manager, I suppose, is the new feather to the bow, has to be putting self-care first into every single communication with yourself, with the team that you're managing. Then we're going to look at some pitfalls, a few things that might happen, might have already happened while you're adapting to remote working, and a couple of things maybe to kind of keep in mind, very common things that just kind of naturally happen as a consequence of this adapting, and also especially in the kind of crisis context we are all doing this in. Then we're going to look at the manager's role. I suppose, again, coming out of the pitfalls, really, what it is, kind of whittling it down to what the exact role is. And the more we are aware of the role, the more we can kind of hold our own in the role, which in itself is a great resilience builder, really, because it is kind of like a suit of armor. This role now is kind of like your self-preservation, as well as really doing well with your team and managing directly. I'm going to finish then with a number of tips, I suppose, kind of coming out of a larger program that I do on Managing Director, and also coming out of this whole idea of crisis leadership, which is again another program that I do in this series with SureSkills, and it is something that I do anyway in my training with NGOs and people out very much in the front line, leading people through emergencies, etc. So hopefully this will be helpful. The idea is that it stays with you, that it is a resource for you, and then of course that we are always available to take any questions or any further queries that you might have. So I'm going to jump right in here. Like I said, people in the role of management or leadership now in this context of working from home have to be aware of the importance of self-care, and indeed even its link to eventual good levels of productivity as well. In most cases of remote working, this is not really something that has to come to the fore, at least not a priority. But it is in because actually normally working from home and remote working is usually a facility. It's something that's becoming more and more common in the workplace, and thankfully we have all a bit of a smattering with it because of its, I suppose, the ability now with technology, etc. And more workplaces offer this. Usually it's offered to a person as an option, or possibly even, a perk of some kind, to have a day or maybe 2 days at home. It cuts down on commutes and there's lots of really, really good advantages. However, in a crisis, working remotely is now a necessity and nobody has a choice. We all have to adapt. So there's people out there, there's managers out there who don't like it. There's people who are being managed who don't like it. And so we're all having to adapt to this imposed situation of remote working. So that does change a little. And for that reason, given that it is a crisis and people have a lot of real concerns going on, a new management role is self-care, your own first and foremost, and then putting it into every communication with your team, every stand-up, every meeting online, every call. This has to be always the first thing that is said from the manager. So taking it into account that clearly, if we just even look at how we adapted ourselves, these new conditions are going to take time. And what I've found over the last short while since this all happened is that managers are actually reporting wonderful responses from their staff in many, many ways. And that is great, a thing to harness, because what happens a lot of the time is that people have these really almost heroic responses, but there can be a bit of a crash to come. So don't be, I suppose, surprised if some of the behaviours later on, as we go into our third week effectively with this, that isn't always going to be there. So because adapting takes time, there's highs and lows with it. So be aware and looking out for that. Staff will clearly have other demands, and some of them have to come first. Family, whether it's all going well or not, as the case may be, there are going to be demands on people's time, and people having to share space, share technology, share computers, who knows. So that is one. Health doesn't even need to be mentioned. It could be another family member, could be not knowing whether you have an appointment or not, all the kinds of concerns. Finance, a huge concern or huge worry for people. And then there's ongoing uncertainty, and that absolutely nobody has the answers. So really, an awareness of this is so important. And I don't think people really need to be reminded about that, because we all have them. Technical issues could start out great. People could have set themselves up really, really well, and lo and behold, a computer crashes or something happens. So it actually is changing day to day. So whether it started out well or not, expect that kind of those unexpected, I suppose, technological issues coming up. And mental health is something that we're all going to be doing, I suppose, hearing more and more about, and the impact of this sudden change, and then the impact of isolation. Again, some people have told me that they are thriving with this new way of working, that they are enjoying it, that the whole social aspect of going to work was something that they saw as a chore, and they're doing great. Others, no, they're suffering, and isolation is the first thing, I suppose, or the first symptom to look out for. And managers actually do have a role, a formal role, in minimising that, and we'll look at that in a moment. So looking at those, I suppose what I mentioned is the 4 common pitfalls you can fall into, or indeed your staff can fall into, while you are adapting, during this adaptation time, this transition into remote management. Definitely pitfalls for managers, and we look at it from that point of view, because this is about managing remotely. And this thinking that in an emergency there will be no real kind of petty admin obstacles of any kind, that we just sweep them out of the way and it'll all be, fine. Unfortunately, no, there will be, even in the most critical situations. And I've worked with managers working out in emergency situations with refugees and people, very, very harsh working conditions. There are always going to be admin tasks that need to be done. These are frustrations in normal situations, but these can be really, really tough in I suppose, adapting or in remote working situations, and very, very frustrating. They can lead to feeling, I suppose, people feeling quite isolated, alone with a problem that they can't solve, or alone with a pile up of admin that they didn't ask, or generate even themselves. Can lead to people feeling overwhelmed and burnt out. So keeping that going, keeping it ticking over, is really, really important. The next one is this idea for managers that all tasks are essential, which is completely not true, even in normal management, local management, as opposed to remote management, but definitely in the crisis situation that we're in, they're not. If we start to see every task as essential, again, it will lead us to this sense of burnout and being overwhelmed. And often the upshot of feeling overwhelmed when we're working remotely is a sense of apathy and just kind of disconnecting and withdrawing from the situation. So it's one to be careful of. In the idea that if we consider everything to be essential, everything kind of comes up to the same level, and nothing is prioritized, so that nothing, in fact, is essential. It kind of goes to that place of kind of, we'll never get to all of this, so we can't get to any of it. So just to avoid that kind of thinking, yes, there are tasks that need to be done that may feel like, in the previous slide, those tasks that may feel like, oh, they're gone, we don't have to do anything about them. We do, And yet at the same time, this ability to prioritize so that those urgent tasks stand up and make themselves noticed more than others. That you are completely irreplaceable. You probably are in many other aspects of your lives, but in a crisis, the clearest route, the shortest route to burnout is this kind of thinking for managers, that you must be there, that you must be over everything, that you must have control over what's going on. You will really burn yourselves out, especially with the level of concern and unanswered questions that we're all working in, this kind of fog of uncertainty at the moment. A wonderful thing, if you can at the moment, is to appoint one or two people that you trust on your team, and give them some extra responsibilities, give them some leadership tasks to take on, and make sure the rest of the team are aware of it. What people are reporting to me at the moment is that this particular aspect of adjusting to working from home in this crisis is that people are really rising to those challenges. So there's a lot to be gained in putting these extra responsibilities on some people for the greater good. You may not be able to promise anything in particular back for them, but of course, in the longer scheme of things, there could be lots of good things for them out of that as well. But generally speaking, the reports are that people are really rising to the opportunities, or to the new responsibilities. One other big mistake people make is that interpersonal issues will just kind of disappear in this kind of, greater effort for the greater good. But again, unfortunately, they more than likely won't. So be aware of any interpersonal issues that were going on among your team, as there always is. And be aware of that. In fact, a crisis may, in fact, even serve to deepen those issues. People who don't trust each other may trust each other even less when they're working remotely together on something, or people who've had a little history of conflict or something between them. Those things can tend to come back a little bit, especially when we're feeling a little isolated, etc. So being aware of it as a manager, naming it for yourself in your to-do list or in your things for the week, and putting them in and making sure that they're properly addressed in your planning and in your communication. It is important to, I suppose, expect from everybody, even the most consistent, kind of stable people on your team, it's very important to expect some of the behaviors to surprise you. We need to remember that responses to crisis, responses to sudden change even, can bring both physical and cognitive responses. And this is coming very much out of this kind of crisis leadership that I deliver as well. But I decided to leave this slide in because I think it's really important for people to be aware. If you imagine that your team, having come through the changes of the last previous weeks, maybe kind of up at this level already, kind of high pitch level in their responses to new requirements and new news, possibly not so good news. And so we have what we call in leadership in crisis increased startle response. Now it sounds very terminology driven, but what it means is that when a person's already up to a certain level of stress, let's say, a new requirement comes in or a new piece of news comes in, and we have a kind of an exaggerated response to it, an almost startled response, that comes of kind of trying so hard to keep things going. And it can cause kind of people to have almost exaggerated responses. So when that happens, consider it as normal, and allow a person the time to compose and come back down to their kind of sense of normality. Lots of physical responses to stress there that you can look through after. And then obviously the cognitive thing, we all know it ourselves. When things are stressful, we find it hard to focus. We find it hard to even create a rational sentence. Then we can go into things like blaming other people, looking for ways of blaming, or for kind of releasing anger, things that we might feel. And this all or nothing thinking, again, back to the idea, all tasks, if all tasks are essential, nothing is essential. If I can't get this small thing done today, well, I can't get anything done today. And those are the ways people go, unfortunately. So just be aware of those two levels of response, and I suppose try to see them as normal. The easier you see them as normal, the easier you'll find a good response to them. So thinking about that as your response as a manager, I've kind of whittled down the role of manager to something that's and kind of reshuffled the importance of the role of manager into the kind of order I think that it should be at the moment, and especially adapting to working from home. This idea of minimizing team member isolation and maximizing self-care. Again, I can't stress it enough. This needs to be front loaded into every communication you have with your team. It is your role as leader of the team to put that first and make sure your team know that comes first. Your self-care and their self-care is priority now. Of course, then come in things like assessing team member competencies. People can really surprise you as much with maybe the negative impacts of stress, but also with the wonderful personal skills that you'd never got an opportunity to see or to notice before, or even for themselves to use. So assessing these competencies that are showing themselves, and assessing a team member's contribution, for the good and the bad, I suppose, is very much still the role of the manager, and measuring team performance. Each individual's performance still requires measurement, and they really need your feedback on that on a regular basis, both across the team, maybe in the online stand-up in the mornings, or in individual one-to-one conversations where they're getting specific and objective feedback on their contributions and their performance. Keeping things consistent. What was the strategy before the change happened, and what is the strategy now? Is it as consistent with the all stakeholders' vision, or is there some change to make there? And if so, this needs to be very clearly communicated to everybody, and even checked for a shared understanding of what this adapted strategy or vision might be. It's still a manager's role to keep their team cohesive together, to develop their team. So finding ways for doing that. I'll be going into some tips a little bit later on. Minimizing work fragmentation, this idea that maybe you might end up with two people doing the same job. So trying to avoid in your planning for the week any kind of overlapping of work, and getting into that habit of maybe not being a little bit less effective, and trying to really make sure that everybody's doing a task that will be leading to the achievement and getting everybody over the line in their task list for the week. And more than ever, celebrating even the smallest, most minor group success, everybody managing to get online at the same time, everybody managing to have an effective meeting, the fact that meetings are getting better and better online, people are working better and better from home. All of these need to be celebrated in one way, at least remarked upon, and brought to people's attention that you're noticing these things and you're so happy about them, because they are helping and they will keep people focused. Coming back to the idea, that first point of the role there, this idea of front-loading self-care, it is really rule number one from now on until this passes. Distribute self-care information. Possibly the fact that that's coming from the manager really shows that kind of, very, I suppose, informal aspect to your role in the team now, from a point of view of things like meditations or yoga or healthy eating or drinking tips. Not that you have to do this with them, guys, but it's simply that you're doing this, or you're researching into this and finding the benefits. Encouraging maybe a shared document on Google Drive or something, exchanges of things like recipes, links that you might have come across to good quality online free classes, inspirational videos. I think social media is actually coming down with them at the moment, but maybe there's some really good classic ones you've come across, and to share those. Assess your own stressors, being a good model of stress management, and knowing your team and knowing what their needs might be at this time. Any other knowledge that you have informally about your team members, from experience of working with them, really will help you now in how you approach managing them at this time. There's asterisks over those guys, just to kind of, I suppose, point out that this is part of a bigger program that I do on leadership in crisis. Again, from a point of view of organization, rule number 2, making sure that the communication you decide to use, and I have some, examples on the next slide, are really solid, and that you stick with them. So if you go with, Zoom or WebEx or whatever the platform that you're using, that's what everybody uses, and everybody goes in there, and everybody gets really good at it. Then coming out of that, then how are you going to be contacted for things that are urgent or time sensitive? Is there a WhatsApp group? I think that they can be very helpful. Be careful not to use them with too many high numbers, and that messages don't get lost, because it's an ongoing kind of thread. Likewise for emails. So that they are there, yes, very useful, absolutely, but that they're used only for specific functions. I'm sure you've already done this all at this stage, but setting remote office hours and making the schedules work within those hours, really, really important. There will be a little bit of leakage, I suppose, out and before from that, but really as much as possible, so that, meetings, deadlines, performance feedback, one-to-ones, end of business, milestones for tasks that may be set over a week or two, all of these things should be within the schedule of the working hours. And should anything go belly up, it can happen, it will happen. People won't be able to make meetings at the last minute. It could be you even not able to make it. Again, everything goes back to the schedule the following day, and everybody knows that just because one meeting didn't work or didn't happen as it should, that everybody knows that it's back to normal the next day, and everybody's expected to be there the next day. Like I already said, feedback is essential at this time, and finding the time to give that feedback, constructive, objective feedback, one-to-one, is really invaluable at the moment. People who are already feeling quite remote and isolated really do need that from you now. I'm not going to go through much on this, because this has just kind of really, the most important, or the kind of biggest well-known platforms that are out there. You're probably already quite, dab hand using them. But just there underneath them, there's a few little pointers. Again, like avoiding anything that has threads, like email or WhatsApp or whatever. Avoid overuse of them, because a lot gets lost. One platform, use one and stick with it. And then individual texts and calls, the fact that should be only for urgency or time sensitive tasks, it should be very clear for people, so that, again, you, the manager, when something comes through your phone, that it's actually really important, that you have to drop whatever you're doing and pick that up. And then this idea, I suppose, of making from the point of view of making the remote local, from a point of view of how you're managing people. So the people management part is still really important. That accessibility that you would have had when things were local, finding ways as much as possible to keep that going, and really being aware that relationships between team members can be strengthening right now, or the opposite. They can be maybe, coming to whatever weaknesses that might have been there before might be showing themselves as well. So staying focused on these kinds of things, even though they don't appear to be priorities in the crisis that we're in, keeping an eye on that is very important. And they can be done through the daily stand-ups. They can be done in your planning, the roles and the delegation that you are assigning people, and the levels of responsibility, and maybe the increased levels of responsibility that you're asking from people, can all be part of building those relationships, that kind of interdependency, that kind of healthy interdependency that can be strengthened at this time. I think a good way about this is it might already have happened kind of naturally, but we kind of structure in remote working, we kind of structure the day into 3 chunks of time. So that kind of morning stand up, where are we at? What are we doing? Where are we going today? Time. Then everybody gets into their day. Maybe there's some sort of in and around just the early afternoon, some kind of check-in, maybe populating shared documents time, these things where people know what's going on, and maybe a kind of a quick one-to-one with certain members. And then the third chunk being, at the end of business, before that kind of scheduled knock-off time, what needs to be done there. So that those 3 chunks of time can be very helpful in time management. Sometimes tasks are very clear and it's very easy to work your way through them. Other times they're a little bit abstract and they need that kind of structure. Obviously, shared docs are invaluable at the moment, so people can go in and raise questions and let people know where they're at, what they're doing. Another thing to keep focused on is what your team expects of you at the moment. Is there anything that you're not thinking about? And it's a great way of opening up a meeting, a roundup kind of meeting, maybe at the end of the day, maybe at the end of the week, asking people, have I come up with what you've needed from me, or are there things now that have come up that you need that you don't normally need from me that you want now, or whatever. So these are great questions to, I suppose, encourage that coaching approach to crisis leadership. And then ask the team what they expect of each other. And again, this is something that they can exchange on and maybe think about for the first time. And of course, you of them has to be absolutely very clear as well. Performance management, absolutely crucial management role at the moment. And I suppose it's coming up really into sharp focus, how people are contributing and maybe those who aren't as well. But just kind of set it as a kind of a rule of thumb for yourselves that once a week there'll be a feedback session, one-to-one. Doesn't have to be long. It could even be a written one, but some form of recognition of work well done. And should the need arise, I suppose a way of telling a person that you are also seeing where they're struggling or where there's been a little bit of a slip in performance. Could be because of the adapting period, absolutely. But it could also be maybe a tendency of a person to sit back and allow the team maybe to carry them for a little while. Just allowing a person know that you've seen it, that you're watching, that you are, I suppose, observant, and that you're able to put the ball in their court to do something about it, that they can come back themselves, that there's no huge need for anything more unless it really is, a case of very clear underperformance. A great way of understanding shared expectations, or a shared understanding of expectations, is really important at the moment. And people's to what level are they responsible and accountable for tasks that you might be delegating, let's say at the beginning of the week. So making sure that happens so that you're not preoccupied, that they may be going along without coming back to you when they should, etc. So the best way to do that is to ask them. Just, you delegate a task, ask them to tell you what their understanding of it is, when you think it's relevant or appropriate for them to feedback to you on progress, and how far they feel that they are responsible for that. Great one for, I suppose, this sense of task ownership, which is, of course, of huge importance during this time. The people you're delegating to feel that they have, they have the whole task and that they are over it and accountable for it. Obviously, continuing to assess your team's standard of performance. Before all of this, what was going on? Were they meeting it? Were they meeting your expectations and standards? Were they exceeding it? Fantastic. Or maybe not. Were there parts of their performance as a team that they weren't actually meeting your standard of excellence? And again, that really needs to be assessed and addressed to the team in meetings, and then as you delegate and oversee their performance. And remember, really, I'm sure you're all witness to this level of incredible innovation that's happening as a very typical response to crisis. People, the best of us comes out, I suppose, and this is highly motivating. And what is exactly what we need in this time is that it generates discretionary effort, that extra mile that people are willing to go in this particular time, and it's exactly what you need. It's exactly what any manager wants in any form of team management and performance. So remember that innovation. And I suppose the greatest and nicest thing you can do for your team is to show that you value any form or any sign of innovation that's coming from the team, allowing for ideas, even setting up a document for idea generation, people to have ideas, to develop ideas. There's nothing more motivating to hear from their manager in times of crisis and isolation that their ideas are heard, that they're valued. They may not all be feasible, but it's okay. Allowing staff to go into that creative idea generating place will oil up that machine that maybe didn't need to be used so much in normal times, and bring possibly fantastic ideas to the table, that people that can really practically help everybody. And I'll just finish, guys, with this last slide. It's one of those very familiar management tools out there, and I think it really is really coming into its own in this time of, I suppose, enforced remote management. It is not a time to be going to look for new clever ways of doing this. Our learning curves are already peaking with all of the other things we have to adapt to. So familiar coaching approach that SMART goals are. Don't burden yourselves with making a really well thought through SMART goals for everybody on your team. Task them to SMART goal their main, let's say their main top 3 tasks for the week. Ask them to SMART goal them for you and send them back to you. And then you can have that discussion on how far you understand each other on what has to happen, etc., and how. So using these older tools, another one is the SWOT analysis, the strengths, weaknesses, threats and opportunities. Wonderful as well for really getting a sense of where you're at. And really they really have that kind of, I suppose, sense of reassurance that we can get from knowing that people are working according to something like SMART goals. So I'll leave it there, guys, and wish you the very, very best of luck. Do remember myself, Paula Lonergan, and Will and the team at SureSkills are there, and we're online, and we're approachable at all times. So any questions that are coming out of this, any doubts or any comments at all, I'm more than happy to hear from you. So take care, and take take your time with this. It'll all come right in the end. We'll see you soon.